As you probably already know, the NBA isn't just about spectacular play on the court. The things that happen off the court are just as important. We've seen a ton of news coverage over the past couple weeks about the NBA salary cap, especially the restrictions caused by the second apron. It's complex, and violating the rules results in massive penalties for the team in question. Well, the NBA's current salary cap rules are a little bit complex. It's going to take me maybe a little bit more time before I can really break them down into a single video. So instead of starting there at the deep end, I thought let's start at a more basic point, which is why does the NBA have a salary cap in the first place? The truth is that salary caps in general are anti-competitive and are designed to keep player salaries down as much as possible. They tend to be popular in closed leagues, which is the kind of league system we see in the United States and Canada. They also tend to be accompanied by features you're pretty familiar with if you're an NBA fan, such as revenue sharing and the draft. So let me back up a little bit. The NBA uses what I call the National League system of league management. This harkens back to the establishment of baseball's National League in 1875. That league was designed specifically to create territorial monopolies to prevent multiple teams from congregating in the same city. There was a gentleman's agreement among owners not to sign players from other teams. This provides a pretty stark contrast to the system you see in most soccer leagues in Europe, which tend to use promotion and relegation. The truth is that the National League system is a monopolistic system. It comes straight out of the Gilded Age. It's monopolistic and anti-competitive in nature, and the whole point of the system is to restrict salaries. Now, the real interesting thing here is that the NBA did not have a salary cap for most of its history. In fact, the cap itself is a relatively recent development. It came around in the mid-80s. You can find some information about it online if you look, but if you're trying to figure out why it exists, you have to look a little bit deeper. Before the NBA, there was the NBL, the old National Basketball League. This was one of many early attempts at professional basketball leagues, and it wasn't very stable, nor did it stretch very far geographically. Now, this league wasn't as obscure as you might think. There actually was a lot of newspaper coverage, but it was not very successful. The Basketball Association of America was formed in 1946 to take the professional sport out of small halls and put it into large arenas, in particular hockey arenas. This was a far more ambitious project and covered a much wider geographic area than the NBL ever did. It even included a team up in Toronto. More importantly, teams of the BAA offered higher salaries than the NBL teams offered. This led to quite a bit of controversy among the NBL's star teams and players. In fact, when George Mikan, the biggest star of the age, decided to sign with the Minneapolis Lakers of the BAA in 1948, that basically spelled the end of the old NBL. Only a year later, the NBL and BAA merged to form the National Basketball Association, the NBA. There was apparently a salary cap in the earliest days of either the BAA or the NBL, though I can't quite figure out which league actually had it. The thing is that nobody in the mainstream press was talking about that at the time. I do know, though, that the salary cap disappeared pretty quickly. So the thing is that teams back then were really not making a whole lot of profit anyway. This would be the actual plumber era of the sport that you hear people talk about a lot. It really refers to basketball, professional basketball in America before 1961 or so. You had players who literally had to have second jobs just to make ends meet. In fact, during the glory days of the ABA in the late 1960s and early 70s, the league simply couldn't afford to have a salary cap. The competition for players was fierce, and NBA teams needed to have the power to offer competitive salaries. Naturally, this was a great time for players, provided that the teams could make payroll, that is. You see, the reason why this National League system is so popular is because it takes a lot of the risk out of the equation for the owners of franchises. However, in times of war, when you have to enter into bidding wars to secure the best talent, the risks start to increase. The worst thing that can happen is precisely what happened to many ABA teams. The expenses grew a lot faster than revenue, and the hope of more revenue tomorrow started to fade away. If you've got a completely closed system, though, you're still in business even if your team stinks. Because of the unwelcome competition from the ABA, the NBA started to take desperate measures, doing things like increasing the minimum salary, for example. But then came the early 1980s. Now, the NBA wasn't exactly doing well in the early 1980s, even with Magic Johnson and Larry Bird in the league. And while tape delay certainly was a major issue, it was not the only issue that the league faced. Major League Baseball players went on strike in 1981 after owners insisted on compensation for losing free agents. This was a measure that was clearly designed to stop competition and suppress salaries. A year and a half later, NFL players went on strike to try to force the league to spend 55% of gross revenues on player salaries. And in the middle of all of this, there was talk about a potential NBA strike. A strike in 1982 would have been absolutely horrible for the NBA. Remember, this is right before Jordan, Barkley, Ewing, and some of the other really big stars came into the league. But the thing is that the NBA itself was nowhere near as popular in 1982 as it would eventually have been in like 1992 and so on. The little progress the league had made since the end of the ABA would have completely died off if there had been a strike. The initial issue was at least reported to be demand for a percentage of cable television revenues. It's also interesting to note that the average salary in those days was around $140,000. That included a bunch of players making as much as $800,000 per season, which tells you that the minimum was a lot lower. And the funny thing is that you could easily predict which teams were most competitive just by looking at the average per player salaries. Now, this is the reason why you see salary caps instituted in sports. The excuse is always that the owners need to make sure that there's parity in the league. And to be fair, there is some merit to this argument. Leagues that lack a salary cap, such as Major League Baseball, tend to have significant problems with parity, with imbalance. Good teams will be good forever, and bad teams never stand a chance. That's not the sign of a healthy sport. Now, I'm still a little bit fuzzy on the precise details. There's not a lot of great information out there. However, it seems that the owners proposed a salary cap sometime in the summer of 1982, prompting the Players Association to sue the league. The concern was that limiting salaries would essentially kill free agency. It would be collusion. The old system was based upon an agreement that Oscar Robertson had reached with the league back in 1970. And the interesting thing is that the original salary cap levels were so low that star players like Moses Malone would wind up taking more than half of the salary cap space of his team. That should sound familiar to you. This is very similar to the problems that the second apron is causing right now. As I said before, you have to keep in mind that salary caps are not really about parity. Instead, they're about doing whatever is possible to keep salaries down as low as possible. It's collusion, it's anti-competitive behavior on the part of ownership. But then again, the leagues are founded on the basis of anti-competitive behavior to begin with, the National League model, so we shouldn't be surprised. In the end, though, the agreement did go into effect. There was no strike and the league played on. In fact, though it didn't receive much coverage at the time, it seems that the league also agreed to a salary floor. This is an important step in preventing teams from paying nothing to players and really not trying. Now, as is usually the case, teams figured out ways from the start to skirt the salary cap rules. It turns out that people who compete with each other are really bad at colluding. The coming salary cap also likely had something to do with certain star college players deciding to go pro a little bit early. And it makes sense, right? If you're a player, you naturally want to earn more money, not less. And the other thing I should say, to be fair, is that the NBA's salary cap actually does work, and the league has quite a bit of parity. I mean, we just saw Oklahoma City play Indiana in the NBA Finals. Fans and people associated with the league back in the mid-1980s praised the cap as a return to sanity. But of course, there were still critics of the system. General managers were forced to do what they could to stop their payrolls from ballooning over the new limits, something that we're seeing happen again right now. In the end, though, the most convincing argument for the salary cap is probably this figure from 1984, which shows that the majority of NBA championships to that time had been won by the same two teams, the Boston Celtics and Los Angeles Lakers. And you know, maybe that's the biggest victory of the NBA salary cap, the end of the Celtics-Lakers dynasties. But what do you think? Is the salary cap and that salary floor, which fewer people talk about, is it good for the NBA? Should other sports do the same thing? Let me know in the comments.